You are Harry Truman. The year is 1945, and you are being called upon to make a decision that you never dreamed you would have to make. In fact, as of 4 or 5 months earlier, you never imagined that any human leader would be asked to make a decision like this. The question is, the problem before you is, Mr. President Truman, do you use the new atom bomb against Japan? So, this is the question, and you are Harry Truman. How are you going to answer the question? A little bit of background. Harry Truman was nobody's idea of a president. As recently as a year before this moment. So the moment we're talking about, the moment of decision, is the summer of 1945. In the summer of 1944, nobody thought of Harry Truman as presidential material. Harry Truman was considered to be something of a hack politician from Missouri. He was a senator from Missouri. He had done reasonably good committee work in the Senate, but he had never shown any aspirations to be president. He certainly didn't inspire presidential thoughts in other people. The reason he became president is that there was a revolt in the Democratic Party against the then Vice President, Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was this unreconstructed New Dealer, a lefty politician by the standards of his day. And there were a lot of Democrats who didn't agree with his policies. He was vice president. Franklin Roosevelt was about to run for his 4th term as president. Presidents didn't get more than 2 terms before Franklin Roosevelt broke the de facto 2-term rule in 1940. And his excuse, his reason was, World War was going on in Europe and in the Pacific, and the United States needed a steady, experienced hand at the leadership tiller. And voters were persuaded, and Franklin Roosevelt was reelected. He ran again. He was going to run again a 4th time in 1944. The war was still on, and the same argument was used in 1944 as had been used in 1940. But this time, Franklin Roosevelt was clearly aging in office. His health was not particularly good. He'd been a robust guy, had been healthy and active until he was 39 when he contracted polio. Since then, he had been largely confined to a wheelchair, but he developed other physical ailments. And people who observed Roosevelt during the war years could see that the man who was running for office in 1944 was not the same man who certainly had run in 1932. And there was some reasonable expectation that Franklin Roosevelt might not survive his 4th term should he win. And so those Democrats in particular said, well, we don't want to be saddled with Henry Wallace as President of the United States. Get somebody that people can't complain about. And so Roosevelt said, how about that guy Truman from Missouri? And so Harry Truman was chosen. And the choice took him almost as much by surprise as it took a lot of other people. And he quickly settled into being vice president. He was a vice president who had next to no input into the decisions of the president. He wasn't included in the most important meetings, and he wasn't briefed on the big military secrets, the military plans going forward. Because vice presidents, what do? They basically, they preside over the Senate, and Truman was willing to do that, having been a senator, but he was not in on the big decisions of the Franklin Roosevelt administration. And then Franklin Roosevelt died. That the fear of those people who said we can't have Henry Wallace as our next president came true. Franklin Roosevelt died suddenly in April 1945, and Harry Truman was suddenly President of the United States, in charge of the United States during the climactic moments of World War II. So the steel ring was closing in on Nazi Germany, on Hitler and the Germans, as of April 1945. And one could see to the end of the war in Europe. But all of a sudden, Truman is the one who has to oversee this end game. He hadn't expected this. It absolutely flabbergasted him that he was now President of the United States. He told a bunch of reporters, boy, it feels as like the sun, moon, the stars, and everything is just falling right on me. And so he's got to learn a lot. He's got to figure out what to do in this unaccustomed position as President, and yes, Commander-in-Chief of the American Armed Forces during wartime. And this was a historically large and unprecedented war. So all of a sudden, there's stuff he has to know about. And in fact, the one thing that he knew nothing about, he was briefed on shortly after he became president. The Secretary of War said, "Mr. President, there's something I got to tell you." And what Truman was told was that the United States had been embarked on this secret project to build what's going to be the atom bomb. Nobody exactly knew what to call it because nobody outside, just a narrow group of people, knew exactly what it was. But it was this top secret program, the Manhattan Project. And it was getting to the point where the scientists and the engineers were about ready to test this new device. Couldn't call it a weapon yet because they didn't know if it worked. But it'd be a few months away. So Truman learns about it. So, okay, well, I don't have to make any decisions yet because it doesn't yet exist as a weapon. So he proceeded with his business as president, the diplomacy, the overseeing of the end of the war against Germany. The war against Germany ends in May 1945. And Truman has not been called upon to make any decision about the use or non-use of this atom bomb. But the war against Japan continues. It continues from May to June to July. And it looks as though it might go on for many months more. American and Allied forces are closing in on the Japanese home islands. But the Japanese are fighting bitterly. And in some cases, they're fighting literally to the last man. The American War Department, the American Navy Department, are making plans for an invasion of the Japanese home islands. And they envision that if an invasion of the Japanese home islands is required, the war might go on for months more. The war might go into 1946. If the Japanese are as determined to hold the home islands as they have been to hold the islands that they have been defending, and been rooted out at great American and Allied cost. So this is the situation when, in July 1945, the atom bomb is tested. Again, this atomic device is tested in New Mexico. Until it was tested, even the most optimistic of those scientists and engineers who were working on it couldn't be absolutely sure it would work. But then it did work. In fact, it worked to a degree that exceeded their greatest expectations, or in some cases their greatest fears. It was this enormous blast. And it looked like the sort of thing where this single device, this single bomb, could flatten an entire city. Now, for perspective, American bombers and British bombers in Europe had leveled cities in Germany, had leveled cities in Japan. Tokyo, the capital of Japan, had been firebombed to a fare thee well. And many, many thousands, scores of thousands of people had been killed. And much of the city had gone up in flames. There were these horrible, terrible conflagrations where the incendiary bombs would light the wooden structures on fire and they'd go up and people would be killed by the tens, the scores of thousands. And so the destruction of cities was something, I should point out, that before the war began, almost nobody would have envisioned that the United States would ever be responsible for such destruction and such killings of large numbers of non-combatants, of civilians. But the war changed a lot of people's thinkings. And especially after the defeat of the Nazis in Germany, when the death camps of the Holocaust were discovered, and it was learned that millions of Jews had been killed by the Germans. I mean, obviously they weren't the Japanese, but people just got kind of used to deaths on a very large scale. This is a horrible war. We have to do whatever is necessary to defeat the enemy. This was very much of the thinking. Okay, so now, you're Harry Truman. You've got this bomb. The bomb worked in New Mexico. The question is, do you use it against Japan? So, Mr. President, what are you going to do? So, people come up to you and give you advice. You appoint a scientific committee. So, what are my options? And your options are basically these. You can use the bomb just as though it's any kind of ordinary weapon. Use the bomb without warning. When American planes firebombed Tokyo, they didn't send in advance warning saying, get out of the way, we're going to bomb it. No, the whole point is to inflict damage, to inflict punishment on Japan. So option one, Mr. President, is you can use the bomb without warning. Okay, consider that. Option two, you can give a warning saying, okay, Japan, this is your last chance. Surrender, or we're going to destroy you with this new weapon. Or we're going to destroy you. Or basically warn them that if you don't surrender right now, really bad things are going to happen to you. So that's option two. A third option is use the bomb, but don't use it directly on a Japanese city. Use it on something else. Use it on a demonstration target. Say, for example, pick an island in the Pacific and tell the Japanese government, okay, we're going to drop this bomb on this island. We want you to watch because this is going to happen to you. This is going to happen to Japanese cities if you don't surrender right now. So your third option is a demonstration. And then, of course, if they still don't want to surrender, then you use the bomb against the city. So in that case, you can escalate from this option three now to option, well, by this point, I guess it would be 2 or 1. A fourth option is just don't use it at all. Just say, you can say, okay, we've come this far without using the bomb, and we can win the war without the bomb. So, and I guess I should add that it's in the nature of this bomb that even if you drop it on something that you might think is, something you might call a military target, it's going to kill lots of civilians. So just bear this in mind. You're not simply killing soldiers, people who have the uniform on. You're going to be killing a lot of people who aren't in the armed forces. You're probably going to be killing a lot of women and children and old folks. Just keep this in mind if you use the bomb. So, Mr. President, and so for this reason, maybe you're going to say, no, don't want to use the bomb. Okay, so these are your choices. So what do you do? And how do you decide? How do you make your decision? You should probably think of this in terms of, well, you should think about it in terms of military strategy. Of course, this is a war. You might want to consider the diplomatic effects of this. So how does it influence America's relations with Japan, first and foremost, but with other countries as well? So the military, the diplomatic, the political. What are the political aspects of this? A president can never ignore politics, and do the people of the United States have some say about this? And the answer is at first no, because they don't know about this. The test in New Mexico is top secret. So the American people do not know about this bomb. But of course, if you use it, they'll know about it. If you don't use it, they'll probably find out about it sooner or later. So keep that in mind. And then there are, of course, the ethical decisions. And the ethics of this, is it right or wrong? And who determines what's right or wrong? How do you determine what's right and wrong? And whose interests do you have to take into account? So if it's an ethical decision, presumably part of that decision is to be based on, is this good for, well, good for whom? Is it good for America? You are President of the United States of America. So as an ethical matter, it better be good for the United States of America. Is it going to be good for Japan? Now that's a more difficult question, more complicated question. At first glance, anybody would say, well, no, to have this big bomb dropped on Japan is not going to be good for Japan. But maybe it's not quite as straightforward as that. Maybe if you drop this bomb and Japan surrenders, then in the long run, fewer Japanese lives will be lost than if the war drags out. Okay? So that's certainly a possibility. How about for the interests of the world? In fact, as President of the United States, as President of the United States, do you have any obligation to consider the welfare of the people of Japan, this enemy of the United States? Do you have any obligation to consider the welfare of the people of the world? They didn't elect you President of the United States. So here, Mr. President, you have to think as President of the United States. But does that free you from having to think as just an ordinary human being? As a human being, do you have some sort of obligation to your fellow human beings on this earth? So these are the considerations. So I put it to you. What would you do? Well, I'll tell you what Harry Truman did, and most of you will know what Harry Truman did. Well, maybe not the details of it. Harry Truman decided to use the bomb against Japan. But he did give a warning, not a specific warning, not a warning that said, I've got this new weapon that is going to destroy you in a flash if you don't. But he said that unless Japan surrenders, it risks utter destruction. So really bad things are going to happen to Japan if you don't surrender right away. Again, he didn't say, or I'm going to use this bomb, but he did promise, he did threaten destruction of Japan. The Japanese government ignored Truman's warning. So Truman gave orders to use the bomb. The bomb was used first against Hiroshima, and when the Japanese government still refused to surrender, against Nagasaki. And the second bomb was what finally persuaded the Japanese government, the Japanese emperor, to say, enough is enough, we cannot continue the war, we must surrender. So that was the decision, that was Truman's decision. Now Truman later said that he made the decision and he never really had much in the way of second thoughts about it. I'm in no position to gainsay Harry Truman on this. If that's what he said, maybe that's so. I would like to think, though, that occasionally he lay awake nights thinking, boy, did I do the right thing? Because the atom bomb, the two atom bombs, killed roughly 150,000 people, mostly civilians. And they did shorten the war. Did they reduce the number of casualties? Almost certainly, without a doubt. They reduced the number of American casualties. And again, the President of the United States is mostly concerned about Americans and American lives. Harry Truman said in his memoirs that Harry Truman later said that if he had not used the bomb, he would have been impeached. And maybe you can read that as Harry Truman was paying too much attention to the political consequences of this, or after all, the President of the United States is supposed to represent the interests of the people of the United States. And if you had been an American, I'll put you in a position, if you had been a soldier, let's say, who had just been pulled back from the war in Europe after the victory over Germany, and you were scheduled to go out to the Pacific for the invasion of Japan, and Harry Truman did not drop the bomb, and you, let's say, you went off to Japan, I was going to say, and you get killed in Japan, but then afterwards you wouldn't be able to figure this out. But let's say you had friends who were killed in the invasion of Japan. And or let's say you were the parents of a son who was killed in the invasion of Japan, or the child of a father who was killed in the invasion of Japan, because Harry Truman had not dropped the bomb. Would you have felt that the president ought to be impeached? I bet you would have been pretty bitter at the president. So anyway, these are the sorts of decisions that presidents have to make. If you had been Harry Truman, what would you have decided?